But this new national monument also comes at a time when Alabama's state legislature, which of course is overwhelmingly Republican, Alabama's legislature appears poised to do something very, very radical to make sure that Black voters in Alabama cannot elect representatives of their choice. You may have heard the Supreme Court of the United States. This may have crossed your radar. The Supreme Court of the United States, you might know, right now is a very conservative body. A 6-3 hard right conservative majority on the nation's highest court as we speak. But even so, even that hardline conservative 6-3 court could not swallow the recent decision by Alabama's legislature to draw up congressional districts in that state. So there's only one Black majority district in the whole state, in a state where a quarter of the population is Black. The High Court ordered the state of Alabama to make a new map where there are 2 such districts where Black voters might be able to elect a representative of their choice. They have been ordered to do this by the federal courts. Alabama is refusing to do it, even though Alabama technically is a state in the United States of America, which is a country that is technically subject to the rulings of the Supreme Court of the United States. Even the Alabama parts of the United States are subject to federal court orders. But apparently they're deciding on this issue that they maybe don't want to be. So we're going to talk about this more in detail a little later on in the show tonight with someone who's right in the middle of this fight. But Alabama deciding it just might not follow federal court orders when it comes to Black people voting in 2023. It's not like a rascally little tantrum that Alabama is throwing here. This is the whole point of the country kind of stuff. This is as serious as it gets. I mean, defying federal court orders, to state the obvious, that is a fast drive down a short road for any country. And any state in the Deep South, any state that, say, seceded during the Civil War, is very, very well aware of that. They are very well aware of how radical this is. But of course, it's even more resonant, it's even more incendiary to do it right now. Because Governor Slavery was not that bad DeSantis really does not look like he's going to go to the distance in the Republican nominating contest. He's just running a terrible, terrible campaign that's sort of getting worse and more expensive by the day. He seems to be the only person who ever had a prayer of being within shooting distance, proverbial shooting distance, forgive me, of the Republican frontrunner. I mean, the Republican Party really does look poised to renominate its frontrunner, to renominate the candidate who is dominating all their presidential polling by 20, 30, 40 points. And if nobody can get anywhere near him, if they do renominate Donald Trump as their candidate for president, that means the whole campaign for president, the whole election for president of the United States over the course of this next year is going to be, in large part, a referendum on this question of whether we follow court orders anymore as a country, whether the legal system binds us, whether it binds all of us. Because the likely Republican nominee for president, as things are going, the prohibitive favorite to be the Republican nominee for president, he is facing a trial in October on a $250 million civil fraud case brought by the New York Attorney General, then another civil trial in January on defamation claims related to sexual assault allegations against him, then another civil trial later in January on a multi-million-dollar civil fraud case related to an alleged pyramid scheme type thing that he was involved in, then a criminal trial in March on the New York State hush money charges, then a federal criminal trial in May on his federal felony criminal indictment for his handling of classified documents. And meanwhile, we're waiting on news of additional potential criminal indictments of him personally, both at the federal level and in the state of Georgia, related to his efforts to overthrow the government and stay in power after he lost re-election. So if that's the, personal schedule of the Republican Party nominee for president, A, busy, and B, the election is going to be about this. It's going to be the referendum question posed both implicitly and explicitly by his candidacy. Do we choose him or do we choose law? Do we choose the law? Does the law apply to us all? Does it protect us all? Does it constrain us all? Or do we want this guy instead? and all of the myriad things he has to offer. The sixth and final episode of my new podcast, Deja News, just posted today. It's been 6 episodes altogether. Now we're done. It's been a blast. It's been a ton of work, but I'm really glad that we did it. You can listen to all 6 of them for free on any podcast app. It's called Rachel Maddow Presents Deja News. And the finale episode that posted today, in part, tells the story of a set of protests and marches that happened in America, in New York City in 1935. In 1935, this is just before World War II, right? Benito Mussolini was the dictator of fascist Italy. He had essentially proclaimed that he was going to send Italian troops to Africa. He was going to invade Ethiopia. He was going to conquer Ethiopia and make it a colony of fascist Italy. And there is just this amazing story about how the US and the major countries in Europe handled that threat from Mussolini, how they handled the question of whether or not to defend Ethiopia, the question of whether Mussolini should be stopped in his effort to go invade that country and take them over, whether he could be stopped from doing that, what the Western powers effectively should do to try to stop him from doing that if they decided he shouldn't be allowed to do it. It's a fascinating story. But there's also this domestic part of it, which feels more and more resonant with each passing day to me. Black New Yorkers at the time lined up and volunteered. They effectively enlisted to go fight the fascists, to go stop that invasion. Look, hundreds of African-American men in Harlem lining up, volunteering to go fight in that war, even if the US military wouldn't. 25,000 New Yorkers marched through New York City demanding that the fascists be stopped. Another 10,000 New Yorkers packed into Madison Square Garden for a huge rally against the fascists. They destroyed a 20-foot effigy of Mussolini on stage. 10,000 people there for that. In other episodes of Deja News, we've looked at the huge protests that erupted very recently in Poland, when their new far-right government mounted a conservative takeover of the courts and then banned abortion. Biggest protests in Poland since the fall of communist rule there in 1989. This weekend, I thought of that a little bit when we saw New Yorkers take over the Brooklyn Bridge in solidarity with the huge, huge protests that are rocking Israel at the moment, as we speak. The right-wing government in Israel today mounting effectively a takeover of the judiciary in that country, which will not only be very convenient for their prime minister who's under criminal indictment, it will also broadly remove the ability of the courts to constrain the government in lots of important ways. Without a written constitution, Israel has no written constitution, the court's ability to constrain the government is effectively the only constraint on the government. And if they're going to get rid of that, well, the government will be unconstrained, starting presumably with the prime minister's ability to dismantle the corruption charges that penned against him while he serves as prime minister. Tens of thousands of Israelis have been protesting for 6 months now against these proposals. The government finally pushed through the first of them today. Knowing that was likely, Tuesday last week, a few hundred protesters set out from the city of Tel Aviv for a march to the capital of Jerusalem. That's about a 40-mile march. They left Tel Aviv on Tuesday, again, several hundred people. By the time they got to the outskirts of Jerusalem on Saturday night, their numbers had swelled from a few hundred people to 20,000 people. Took them 4 nights camping out along the way to get there, but during that time, their numbers grew from several hundred to 20,000. And the protests and demonstrations and roadblocks continue there tonight in Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv and all over that country as demonstrators try to stop their government from taking this huge step away from democratic rule and from limited authority of the country's leader. We are in a moment, at home and abroad, where the hard right, the authoritarian nationalist right, is aggressively ascendant. I think it's fair to say as aggressively ascendant as they have been since the 1930s. A descendant of Mussolini's fascist party is now in power again in Italy. The very far right, the racist far right, made a hard run at the French presidency just a couple of years ago. The hard right is in place, in power in Poland, as I mentioned, where they just banned abortion, in Hungary, of course, in Russia. We all thought they might be in power by today in Spain, but voters there actually surprised everyone this weekend by turning back their far-right nationalist party and sending them packing. They really thought they'd be in power in Spain by today, but instead, in this weekend's elections, they got shellacked. Hello, Spain. But thinking about our own domestic challenges along these lines, running as we are, hard up against these basic questions of whether we're sticking with the rule of law or moving instead toward authoritarian rule, knowing that our likely nominees for the presidency next year are effectively going to be setting up the presidency as a referendum on that guy or the law. Knowing that that's what we are hard up against here in this country, looking at our domestic challenges right now, looking at images from our own history and from Israel this weekend. It's days like this when it's good to remember that it's not just the authoritarian right that is ascendant as a global trend. It is also resistance to authoritarianism that can be a global trend. That is a global trend. The fight back is ascendant too. Resilience matters. The first sign came down. Second one came down too, full of bullet holes. Just like the third one after that. But the fourth one is built stronger and it still stands. And as of tomorrow, it's a national monument of the United States of America. Resistance to this stuff trends too. It is also contagious and emboldening. Thank God. More to come tonight. Stay with us.